Good morning. But let me just start with saying that I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank Stefan very, very much for organizing this wonderful opportunity to come together and exchange ideas about these artists. The Kunstkammer of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna preserves 4 important works by the artists who are the subject of this symposium. The bust of Emperor Charles V and the bust of his sister, Queen Mary of Hungary, both by Leone Leoni and both cast in bronze, as well as this relief in bronze showing Charles V in profile, also by Leone Leoni. And finally, this work attributed to Leone's son, Pompeo, a polychromed head in silver depicting King Philip II of Spain. I will focus on the latter in my talk, while we will hear more about the other 3 portraits, I suppose, in the talk by Walter Kuperi. The portrait of Philip has always intrigued me, and when I started to study it, I realized that the information given in the scholarly literature so far contains some misleading and some outright wrong statements, which, however, have been repeated so often by now that they are considered as facts and have thus prevented any further critical analysis of the bust in Vienna. The bust is of course mentioned in all the more recent books on the 2 Leoni, and it was included in the great exhibitions dealing with their art as well as with the arts and time of Philip II. But in truth, it has remained a puzzle, although one does not seem to be aware of it. I would like, therefore, to clarify some of the misconceptions that have unfortunately entered the mainstream of art historical thinking and propose a new theory for consideration. So, what do we actually know about this work of art? The first time it is mentioned for sure is an inventory of the imperial treasury dated 1773. The text reads, "A head cast in silver, the portrait of Philip II of Spain, for which a bust of clay was made by the sculptor Moll on 7th February 1753. This record explains thus the peculiar appearance of the portrait, for the actual bust was added only in the mid-18th century by Balthasar Moll, who was, after Georg Raphael Donner and Lorenzo Mattielli, the most famous Baroque sculptor in Vienna. This bust is executed in painted terracotta and speaks stylistically a totally different language than the head, of course. It is, by the way, by itself, I think, a very good piece of sculpture, nicely done, although one can see how much Moll had to restrain his temperament. I don't think that he was very successful in restraining himself, and personally I think that Philip II would have hated it, particularly the very untidy collar. But just to give you the complete picture, I show you here also one of Moll's best-known works, the elaborate double sarcophagus of Maria Theresia and Emperor Franz Stephan in the Imperial Crypt in Vienna. So this shows you also that when one made the terracotta bust in the 18th century, one did choose a very good sculptor, so this means that the head by Pompeo must have been esteemed very highly at this point. From what I said so far, it becomes thus clear that the head has to be looked at separately from Moll's Baroque terracotta bust. I show you here one more close-up, and here the head removed from Moll's support. Indeed, when talking about this piece, one should not call it a bust, but just a head, at least if we are strict and want to refer only to the work of Pompeo. Now, this remarkable head is made, as I mentioned, of silver. However, and this is quite significant, it was not hammered, as it is stated very often in the literature. It was actually cast. This can be seen when looking inside the detached head. The soft appearance of the surface demonstrates this very clearly, and perhaps one can see it even better in this image, where the facial features of eyes, nose, and mouth appear as an astonishingly lifelike negative form at the inner side of the head. And here my favorite, an almost spooky view with a ghostly face appearing, so to speak, inside the head. That the head was cast is an important piece of information, since so far it was almost always assumed that it was hammered, which would be the classical technique of a goldsmith, a craft in which Pompeo was actually trained. Apart from the polychromy, however, the execution of the head does not differ very much from casting a bronze. As you can see, it is also a very well executed cast of a very even thickness. The metal is actually not pure silver, but an alloy with a high content of silver. And I hope to get an analysis done in the near future. The Viennese head was not included in the first monograph on the two Leoni presented in 1887 by Eugène Plon. It was first published in 1901 by Julius von Schlosser, then director of the Kunstkammer in Vienna. Although he considered the head the work of an important artist, its technique, he thought it to be hammered, confused him, and so he suggested that someone like Jacopo d'Atrezzo, King Philip's jeweler, might have been its maker. After that, the head was included, very tellingly, in the catalogue of the works of goldsmithing in the Viennese Museum, published by the legendary curator Ernst Gries in 1932. In this catalogue, the head is attributed to Pompeo Leoni for the first time, an attribution, as is dutifully mentioned by Gries, that was made orally by Hermann Julius Hermann, a great scholar with a good eye who is today almost forgotten. Hermann was the successor of Julius von Schlosser as director of the Kunstkammer, and his pioneering essay on Antico, to name just one example, is absolutely brilliant. Hermann, also this is reported by Gries, based the attribution of the Viennese silver head on a comparison with the alabaster portrait bust of Philip in the Prado. Unfortunately, one knows very little about this bust. It is not signed, and its attribution to Pompeo is not undisputed. However, I cannot think of anyone else who could have made it than Pompeo. When comparing it with the signed work by Pompeo Leoni, the tomb statue of Princess Juana, I cannot see too much of a difference in the handling of the stone. Please note above all the rendering of the eyes and the eyebrows. In the execution of the bust, there may have been involved also some other hands from the workshop, but that was common practice. The boring details of the armor, for instance, might well have been executed by some assistant. The different parts of the bust, that is, head, armor, and the decorative support, may not be very well balanced, and their sculptural quality is probably also uneven. But I think the overall design of this bust is Pompeo trying to imitate his father's portraits of Charles V. The entire work is certainly not of an overwhelming quality, but then do we think that Pompeo was, as a marble carver, that brilliant? I think he's rather stiff in stone. When putting the head in Vienna next to the Prado bust, the latter looks, of course, much less exciting. But if one compares the rendering of the eyes, one can see the same hand, I think. We find again, as with Princess Juana, the curly eyebrows, and the same shape of the incised pupils. Also, the general modeling of the hair is very similar, but as you can see, the hairline is much higher in the Prado bust. I have something like this? No. I think you see what I mean. That's what is called in German Geheimratsecken. So the hairline is receding. Is there something? With the mouse camera. Okay, I think you know what I mean. And this, I think, means that that the Prado bust was made after the more useful head in Vienna and not the other way around. The much more appealing effect of the Viennese head is mostly due to its material. It is modeled and not carved, and it is beautifully polychromed, which is why I suggest to imagine for a moment the head in Vienna without its color. In this little experiment, I removed the colors and turned the photo digitally into a negative. The result is by no means perfect, but it helps a bit in picturing the head just in, so to speak, pure sculptural forms. Anyway, both works, the Prado bust and the Vienna bust, are only attributions. But I think if you can accept one of them, this goes also for the other. Very funnily, the Vienna bust was never doubted, while the bust in the Prado was. But let us return after these little excursus to our contemplation of the Viennese head. When looking at the head, separated from the 18th century terracotta bust, it becomes obvious that it could not have been meant to look this way, as is also implied by the 4 holes at the edge of the neck. On this image you can see 2, there are 4 all around. The head was clearly supposed to be inserted into something. The general opinion today is that the head was actually made to be displayed together with a suit of armor, as you can see in this image. These are 2 historic black and white photos that document the first installation of the head together with a suit of armor that once belonged to Philip II and which is today kept in the Arms and Armor Department of the Kunsthistorisches Museum. These images were taken in 1961 when Friederike Klauner, later the first female director of the Kunsthistorisches Museum, published an article on Spanish portraiture in which she proposed the idea that this is the way one should envision the original appearance of Pompeius' silver head. The reason why she came up with this theory is a record in another inventory of the imperial treasury in Vienna, the inventory dating from 1677. Quote, "At the other window there is placed a cupboard, inside of which there is the likeness of the Spanish King Philip II carved in wood in the size of a man, which was given by the Duke of Savoy together with the gilded armor of silver, which is covered with pearls and diamonds." End quote. Inspired by this record, it was thus tried to fit the silver head into an actual suit of armor, the very precious one given by the Duke of Savoy having disappeared since for obvious reasons. So let me make this very clear. This is just a suit of armor that happens to be in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It's a suit of armor that we know once belonged to Philip II, and they fitted this suit of armor together with the head. And this experiment was considered very successful because of 2 reasons. First of all, the head fits very well into the armor. Well, this is certainly true, but not by itself remarkable, since the head is made in life size. So this could also be sheer coincidence. Secondly, the metallic character of the head was considered aesthetically very fitting in combination with the cold armor. This can also not be denied, however, but it is by no means a proof for this theory. There is indeed a huge problem. The 1677 inventory, the only reason for this entire theory, I show it here to you again, does never mention a silver head, but only a silver armor. The likeness of the king mentioned in that inventory was carved in wood. And this was perfectly common practice in such life-size dolls or mannequins, which were made to display suits of armor. Such mannequins were usually also wearing the helmet, and one would therefore not see much of the head. So the brilliant Viennese head would have been rather wasted. Just look how carefully the head is modeled all around. There's also another thought. When you imagine that, let's suppose for a moment that the inventory, that the head of armor was really displayed with a suit of armor, and then the suit of armor was sold because silver diamonds, you know, very precious thing. Why would they then not place it again into a suit of armor, just another one, but go rather through the problems of having Balthasar Moll making this very elaborate terracotta bust? So this also does not fit somehow together. So as appealing as it is, the entire idea, I think, should be looked upon with a bit of suspicion. But that was not the case. It just looked so darn good. So the head was displayed with the suit of armor of Maximilian II in a little show in Vienna in 1978, and then again, this time with the suit of armor that once belonged to Philippe II in the big show Trésors de la Toison d'Or in Brussels in 1987, and then again in the famous exhibition on the art at the court of Rudolf II in Vienna in 1989 called Prague around 1600. And today, a copy of the head is still used in the permanent display of our Department of Arms and Armor in the Hofburg in Vienna. But back to the most important of these three exhibitions, the Prague around 1600 show. The entry on Pompeius' head in the authoritative catalogue of this exhibition was, quite understandably, used as a point of departure for almost everything that was written about the object ever since. Unfortunately, this entry offers some pitfalls. First of all, it refers to the inventory of 1677 in a way as if Pompeius' silver head was actually mentioned there. The entry actually says, quote, "According to the inventory of 1677, this naturalistic painted head of silver was united with a splendid suit of armor made of gilded silver," etc. I show you here on the screen again the text of the inventory in translation, so you can see that this is not what is said in this inventory. Nevertheless, this account was repeated in the entries of the Vienna head in the catalogue Los Leoni in 1994 and in the catalogue Felipe II in 1998. Secondly, in the catalogue Prague around 1600, the description of Pompeius' head and the description of the suit of armor in which it was displayed are totally mixed up. So it is no wonder that in the two later exhibitions in Spain, which I just mentioned, Los Leoni and Felipe II, it is reported that the head was mentioned as being at Castle Ambras in 1572. Castle Ambras, just to explain this briefly, was the residence of Archduke Ferdinand of Tyrol, who was a famous collector, particularly of armors of famous people. Well, and this is precisely the point. For it is only Philip's suit of armor that you will find in this inventory. Of Pompeius' head, there is no trace in any of the inventories of Castle Ambras. And please do get me right. This paper is not about blaming anyone. This is really not my intention. It just happened that when I read systematically through the literature, I stumbled about all this utterly confusing misrepresentation. And I think it is important, especially at an occasion such as this symposium, to discuss this and hopefully to clear up these misunderstandings. The literature on the Viennese head is indeed an excellent lesson in how careful one has to be when quoting documents. For example, in the entry in the exhibition Los Leoni, we find reported as a fact that, quote, Pompeo made the head in 1564 for Princess Juana, the sister of Philip II, end quote. Now, that this statement is correct cannot be excluded, but it is by no means certain. As reference for this account is given the remark, according to Plon. But Plon was only publishing a document. He made no connection between this document and the head in Vienna. And here is the document. It is a letter from Princess Juana to her treasurer Manuel Caldera, written on August 10th, 1564. In this letter, she orders that 200 ducats shall be paid to Pompeo Leoni for the execution of a silver head, that is, una cabeza de plata. No subject is given. I think it is rather unlikely that Princess Juana would not say that this head depicts her brother if it were so. A portrait of the King of Spain would hardly be dealt with in such an almost deprecating manner as una cabeza de plata. But of course, we do not know for sure. The only information we may indeed gather from this document is that Pompeo Leoni did in fact execute such works. That is, he did make heads of silver. How they looked like, if they were painted, for instance, we do not know. In this context, Margarita Estella, in an essay on Pompeo she published in 1993, pointed out that there exists another interesting document. A contract between Pompeo and the silversmith Juan Fernandez Carissimo of 11th February 1566, in which Pompeo asks him to make for a price of 25 ducats 3 golas de plata. I suppose gola means something like a collar, with or without lace, but rather something that imitates textile, since it is supposed to go with a jacket, or more accurately, a doublet and a shirt. So these 3 silver collars should be fitted to something which can only be busts. Busts of the king, that is Philip II, and the 2 princes of Bohemia, namely Rudolf and Ernst, the 2 sons of Emperor Maximilian II, who were educated in Spain from 1564 to 1571. A stay which, as you know, was particularly for Rudolf a very decisive one, since it steered in the later emperor the desire to become a collector of art himself. The importance of Emperor Rudolf as collector and patron of the arts need not be discussed here. The fame of the Kunsthistorisches Museum is based to a large extent on his legacy. It is therefore of considerable interest that we find a bust made in silver depicting the King of Spain in the inventory of Rudolf's collection. And that has been overlooked so far. The Rudolphinian inventory was put together between 1606 and 1611. And I'm sorry, I'm afraid all these documents are terribly boring, but just bear with me a little bit longer. So, under the headline, Round Images in Silver, one finds, among different statues and busts, as item 1739, the portrait of the King of Spain in silver. As well, item 107040, a portrait of the Queen of Spain with the remark, both are kept in their cases. A futraln, that is a futteral, means usually a container made of leather, made to measure, for conserving something particularly precious. I show you here as an example the reliquary cross from the treasury in Vienna. It is actually part of the insignia of the Holy Roman Empire, with its case from the early 16th century. I show this to you also as a reminder that this type of conservation, so keeping it in a box, was not only used for precious objects, but also for objects that could not be displayed otherwise. That is, for instance, when they did not have a suitable support. I mention this so that you see that it is also entirely possible that Pompeius' head was never combined with anything, but was just kept in a case. This is definitely a possibility. As I said, the inventory of Rudolf has not been associated with the silver head in Vienna yet, but I think it should. Of all the documents I have shown you, this seems to me the record with the best claim to have something to do with Pompeius' head, simply because the head could very well be the same that is still preserved in the very collection in which it is mentioned. But of course, also this is only a suggestion. It seems to me, however, that it is worth considering, since we know from other sources that Rudolf II specifically sought to acquire works of art which related to his family and in particular to his time in Spain. I don't need to point out how much Rudolf adored Charles V and Philip II. So, what do we really learn from all these documents? Not much. Pompeo Leoni did indeed make heads of silver, and some of them depicted members of the Casa di Austria. Alas, the only example of this activity that has survived is the mysterious head of Philip in Vienna. Although it is not possible to say whether the Spanish documents that are the letter of Princess Juana of 1564 and the ordering of the 3 silver collars by Pompeo of 1566 have anything to do with the head in Vienna or not, the time frame indicated by these documents could be right. That the Viennese head could have been executed in the 1560s would go with the approximate age of the king, who was in his 30s then, an age that one could accept also for the Viennese silver head. As you can see, in Leoni's portrait statue here in the Prado, modeled between 1551 and 1553, Philip had much fuller hair in his youth, while his hairline started to recede when he entered his 30s. I show you here a portrait painted by Anthonis More around 1560. So to presume an execution of the Viennese head in the 1560s might be correct, at least from that point of view. However, it is not advisable to date a portrait based only on the presumed age of the sitter. Indeed, the statues and busts from the Leoni workshop usually follow a certain idealized prototype, and one model could also be copied some years after it was created, as for instance, the bust of Philip II made for the Duke of Alba, today in the collection of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in Windsor Castle and currently on display, beautifully displayed, in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. As you can see, the facial type of this bust, which was made around 1555, was essentially based on the bronze statue in the Prado I showed you before. So these portraits were not updated every couple of years. Only the kneeling king of the tomb monument in the Escorial is individualized to such a degree that it seems plausible that Pompeo based it on life. As you can see, he is old here and almost bald. And now comes the moment of my new bold theory. In the contract for the high altarpiece and the funerary groups for the Basilica in the Escorial, signed on January 10, 1579, it had been agreed that the faces and hands of the figures would be polychromed, encarnado, is the term that was used. At some time before October 1582, probably soon after Pompeius returned to Milan, the king decided, however, to have them completely gilded. This decision was actually lamented strongly by Pompeo in a letter of August 1st, 1585. Now, remember how good Pompeius head looked together with the suit of armor, that is, as an entire figure. Therefore, I asked myself, could this head have been made, could this head have been some sort of a trial, an experiment, a tryout for the Escorial figures? A colored drawing of Philip II kneeling, which is attributed to the Leoni workshop, is considered to reflect an early stage of the design when it was also thought to execute part of the statues, particularly the prie-dieu, entirely in marble. I show you this drawing because it demonstrates that at this stage the king was not yet represented as an old man. As perhaps you can see, I don't know if you can make it out with this, but there is still, he has still sort of full hair. And that his figure would then reflect his actual age was apparently a decision that was made only later on. Finally, as I have pointed out, the Viennese head is cast. And it is therefore possible that it was done when Pompeo was back in Milan in the 1580s. It is always said that Pompeo did not cast in Spain, but perhaps such a small object as a head did not represent the same difficulties as a large statue. So he cast it. But why in silver and not in bronze? Because silver seems to have the better surface for painting. And how to do this one knew in Spain. With polychromed sculpture, I show you here a reliquary bust made of painted silver, as one can find them in great number all over the country. But perhaps nowhere one can find more of them as in the Escorial itself. As we know, relics had an enormous importance for King Philip and for his overall scheme of the Basilica at the Escorial, which became the store of some 7,500 relics. I show you here one of the two reliquary altars, which contains, hidden behind a painting by Federico Zuccaro, a huge case full of relics, many of them in the shape of busts. Each of these two altars contains today almost 40 reliquary busts, which is, however, certainly much less than they contained originally. And here two examples of these busts in a close-up. They are all made of hammered silver. The greatest part of them was executed around 1589 by Juan d'Arfe and painted by Fabrizio Castello, such as the female bust I show you here on the right. And here another view into one of these altars, where you perhaps recognize the head of San Lorenzo on the right, one of the most famous of these busts. And I wish to express here my sincere gratitude to Almuda Perez de Totela for helping me very generously with pictures and information. Thank you. As you can see, these reliquary busts, with their staring eyes and dripping blood, have a very strong effect on the viewer, which was intended, of course, since they should arouse empathy and compassion. And perhaps this is precisely the reason why the king changed his mind. Philip II, who lived as a recluse and did everything to discourage people from approaching him, was the epitome of aloofness. Although he might have liked the idea of being revered like a saint, this palpable humanity was apparently too much for the austere king, who favored dignity, decorum, and distance. Pompeius' head might simply have been too shockingly real. So this is perhaps the reason why the funerary groups in the Escorial were in the end entirely gilded. Thank you very much.
Bien, ya vamos a la próxima conferencia de Kelly Helmstutler. Sí, de Kelly.
In a letter to Camillo Albergotti of 1552, Aretino wrote, "Leone is equal to the ancients. With his medals and with his bronze statues, he outdoes modern sculptors." Despite his inexperience on the grand scale, Leone sought to create sculptures that were unprecedented in their form and challenged the achievements in sculpture of the ancients as well as his contemporaries, particularly Michelangelo and Cellini. Leone's skill and ambition were perfectly suited to the Habsburgs' need for sculpture. Both Charles V and his sister Mary, Queen of Hungary, provided Leone with numerous commissions meant to decorate their palaces, churches, and public spaces. Leone was commissioned for projects that embodied the aspirations and successfully conveyed messages about the imperial authority of the Habsburgs. The sculptures were immediately met with acclaim from his peers and left an important imprint on the Spanish taste for sculpture. The Habsburgs' interest in marble and bronze portrait sculpture and Leone's style and innovative forms spurred aristocrats and members of the court in Italy, Spain, and Flanders to seek out similar sculptures for their own collections. In this paper, I will discuss Leone's portraits and their influence with a special focus on his bust. I will then present new information regarding the taste for portrait bust in Spanish collections in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was during their first meeting at court in 1549 that Emperor Charles V awarded Leone financially, raised him to the rank of nobleman, made him an imperial knight, consented to his proposal for an equestrian monument, and commissioned portrait medals, portrait busts, and life-size portrait statues. Charles's sister, Queen Mary of Hungary, was likewise impressed with Leone's abilities in portraiture and commissioned framed marble reliefs of Charles V and Isabel, marble bust, and full-length marble and bronze portrait statues. Leone had proposed an equestrian monument of Charles V at his first meeting with the emperor. Leone's choice was significant, especially since, as far as we are aware, he had never executed large-scale sculpture. Equestrian monuments were considered the most technically challenging, and Leone knew well the risk involved. A failed project could have meant the end of his career. Clearly, Leone wished to prove his prowess in a grand way that would, as he wrote, cut the tongues of his many detractors. Leone had to prove his mettle with another project, however, since Charles's interest in the equestrian statue project evidently waned rather quickly. Leone began the sculpture group of Charles V and Fury, and he approached the project with the same determination to outdo his predecessors and contemporaries as he had in his proposal for the equestrian monument. The original commission seems only to have included the figure of the emperor. Leone added the nude figure of Fury, which allowed him to deal with the challenge of arranging a multi-figural composition on a base, enabling multiple viewpoints and amplifying the symbolic meaning of the group. As for the base, Leone formed a meticulously detailed pile of trumpets, shields, and various arms. The base adds to the meaning of the group. Charles V, because of his virtue, easily triumphs over the weaknesses of human nature. His victory requires no weapons, as he promotes peace and truth over warfare and vice. Leone saw this sculpture group as a way to transform his career. His investment and ambition and his anxiety about its success is expressed in a letter from December 20th, 1550, in which he wrote, "In our age, no work has been executed which is either more modest or more rare than this. Thus, should His Majesty not accept the design in spite of its merit, I would be forever miserable." Its success is indicated by the immediate and long-lasting influence of Leone's sculptural group on monuments in and outside of Spain. I show a few examples here. In Italy, Ferrante Gonzaga and Envy, produced by Leone and Pompeo Leone, and Simone Moschino's Apotheosis of the Duke of Parma, Alessandro Farnese, of around 1600, now in the Regia di Caserta. They all demonstrate a clear dependence on the imperial group. In Flanders, Jacques Jongelink reused the conceit for the public sculpture of the Duke of Alba conquering Deceit around 1571. The positioning of the figure of Charles V also influenced Jongelink's figure of Mars of his 7-planet series, which eventually came into the Spanish royal collections. In Spain, Pompeo's tomb monument of Fernando de Valdez in the Colegiata di Santa Maria la Mayor in Sales is indebted to the figural arrangement of the imperial group. And here I show a detail graciously provided to me by Charles Coppel. In sum, Charles V in Fury was repeatedly referenced in monuments made to honor men who held important roles in the Habsburg regime, even before it was put on more public display in the royal collections. Its innovative form and iconography were understood as embodying the ideals of Habsburg rule. The sculptures commissioned from Leone by the Habsburgs were eventually interspersed with ancient and modern portraits of past emperors. The paragon Leone had aimed for his works to be compared to the ancients, would have been fulfilled through this manner of display, just as it created a paragon between Charles and Philip and the best ancient rulers. Of course, it's rather easy to trace the artistic influence of the Charles V and Fury group, since the form was so innovative and distinctive. We can also see that his marble figure of Charles V was the source for the figure of Gian Giacomo de' Medici in the tomb project in the Cathedral of Milan. Replicas of the other full-length statues were also made, but it is less evident the extent to which they influenced other sculptures. Instead, the most immediate and widespread dissemination of Leone's artistic ideals happened through smaller-scale sculpture, namely his busts, reliefs, and medals. The first bust he completed was also his most ambitious, the bronze bust of Charles V here at the Prado, done from about 1551 to 53. Charles is dressed in the armor he wore for the Battle of Mühlberg. The breastplate bears an image of the resurrected Christ, which we saw earlier as well, modeled after Michelangelo's risen Christ in Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. On the shoulders are medallions. One is covered by a band of cloth, and the other is a nude female figure holding a palm representing peace. The figure is not arbitrarily truncated mid-torso as most busts. Instead, the figure terminates at the end of the breastplate. Furthermore, the bust is supported not by traditional turned or architectural socle, but by an eagle flanked by male and female seated on dolphins. Stylistically, Leone met the expectations of his patron by imbuing the bust with a sort of tempered realism. The identity of the sitter is as immediately recognizable today as it was then, and Leone wrote, "There's not a hair different between the bust and the man." Of course, Leone didn't show all the physical defects Charles was plagued by. He obviously wanted to keep his job. But his meticulous inclusion of detail and his immense skill in casting was clearly something he wanted to show off in such an early monumental work in his oeuvre. In both the presentation of the sitter and the figurative decoration of the base, Leone transformed the all'antica bust type into something entirely original and meaningful that would more fully convey the intended associations between Charles V and the great ancient Roman emperors. The representation of Charles's descendants from the great Roman emperors was much more immediate with bust. Series of busts of Roman emperors were widely collected, as will be discussed later, and so a 16th or 17th century viewer would have immediately understood the imperial significance of this form. Leone amplified those meanings with his inclusion of other figures that support the bust. Again, Leone sought a comparison with the ancients and his peers. As for the presentation of the sitter, Leone's newly conceived form proposed a solution to a problem that had vexed Renaissance sculptors, namely, how can the whole person of the sitter be indicated while using a truncated form? Irving Lavin surmised that Leone's empty cuirass is a visual pun which suggests that the bust not only contains the sitter, whom the viewer inevitably imagines in toto, but is also a self-contained object, a commemorative monument in its own right. Leone thus developed an innovative way to negotiate the truncated form of the bust. The inclusion of the breast and shoulder plates of the suit of armor completely dissimulate the amputation of torso and arms. In this empty shell, the mind fills with the spirit of the man. I have to have water, Stefan. Could you get water for me? Some water, please. Thank you. Sorry. Otherwise. Thanks. I would like to suggest that Leone pulled from his experience as a goldsmith and medalist, and specifically was influenced by the sorts of objects produced by northern Italian goldsmiths and medalists in the same decades he was making the bust. This expertise allowed him to conceive of an entirely original approach to the truncation of the figure and for the form and decoration of the base. Thank you. Sorry. My nerves are shot. I just flew in yesterday, so forgive me. Thus, Leone didn't hide his experience with goldsmithery, though it was that background that had evidently caused his detractors, whether real or perceived, to question Leone's ability to execute large-scale works. Instead, in this bust, he showed off those skills through the inclusion of the small figures of the support and the incredibly high level of detail in the eagle's feathers, the decoration of the armor, the features of the sitter, and his new approach to the termination of the figure. Leone's truncation of the torso parallels his experimentation with the truncation of figures in his portrait medals. In the introductory chapter of his catalog on Italian medals in British collections, Philip Atwood remarked on a connection between the formal changes in later 16th century medals, where the truncations followed the border of the medal, and bust from the same period, where horizontal bases had been supplanted by the all'antica type set on a sacco. Here, I would like to briefly explore this connection, more specifically in regards to what Leone does in his medals and bust. In fact, it may be asserted that Leone was responsible for this change in conception, and it influenced other medalists and sculptors. In his medals before 1548, Leone terminated the figure either at the terminus of the neck or collarbone, such as we see here in the medals of Leone's first self-portrait medal from 1541, his medal of Baccio Bandinelli, and the Dana medals, most of which we've seen already today. Or in some cases, he did a rather awkward diagonal truncation that followed from the shoulder to mid-chest. In those cases, he tried to foreshorten the figure and turn it at a 3/4 angle to show the breastplate. These attempts were often not terribly successful, in my opinion, such as the early Charles V medals and the Andrea Doria medal from 1541. But beginning with his medal for Prince Philip in 1548, Leone positioned the figure so that the head is in strict profile, but the torso is turned almost completely towards the viewer. In addition, he included a much greater expanse of the torso, terminating the figure at the waistline or slightly above. He used that terminus and the position of the sitter in his subsequent imperial medals, such as these of Charles V and Isabel from 1549, and in these other medals, such as the one of his believed mistress, Danae, and also the one of Ferdinand I from 1551. These are done in the same years Leone is working on the bust, or beginning to work on these busts. Leone likewise experimented with the relationship between the border of the medal and the figure. In most of these examples, he maintains the beaded or smooth incised line at the edge of the medal, including beneath the bust in these other medals I've shown you. In the medals of Michelangelo, the Duke of Sessa, and Ferrante Gonzaga, for example, the figure interrupts the line. As he turned to making bust, he truncated the figures at the same points as he did in his medals. Jacopo Trezzo, and here I have his medals of Philip and Mary I of England, and Pompeo Leone, his medals of Don Carlos and Ercole d'Este, and Annibale Fontana and other Lombard medalists followed Leone's model. In any case, my point is that Leone was experimenting with ways to express the sitter in toto, and its relationship with its border in the case of the medals, or the base in the case of his bust. And he's negotiating this point of termination. In the case of the bust, he was finding ways to join the figure to the base in a way that wouldn't detract and potentially would add to the figure's effectiveness. Importantly, he was working on these solutions in metals in the years he was working on the imperial bust. Leo Planistic dealt with the figures of Leonie's base as examples of smaller scale work by Leonie, and based on their style, he related other statuettes and other objects to Leonie's oeuvre. Jeremy Warren has noted the similarity of Leonie's decoration of fabric and armor in the imperial portraits with the decoration of objects commonly produced by goldsmiths, and we heard more along those lines today from several speakers. And Jeremy suggested that perhaps Leonie or someone in his circle had made this candlestick in the Fortnum collection in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Leonie's familiarity with the production of these sorts of objects, in particular with inkstands and andirons produced in northern Italy in the 16th century, objects commonly produced by goldsmiths, were an important influence for his conception of the base. Another example of this sort of object is a bronze andiron attributed to Tiziano Aspetti in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. As in Leonie's bust, the supporting element has been entirely transformed into a space for figural decoration of very high relief and meticulous ornamental detail. A similar object is this one from the National Gallery of Art in Washington. This andiron dates from the middle of the 17th century, but it's based on a mid-16th century design. I think you can see the similarities in the treatment of the base. Leonie's peers and predecessors had been experimenting with the possibilities for form and meaning in supports. While the medieval bust with no base had remained in fashion, artists throughout Italy had begun experimenting with a more archaeologically accurate all'antica bust. The all'antica bust derived its formal characteristics from Roman busts, not medieval ones. The contrast can be seen in the 15th century example by Mino da Fiesole, the bust of Piero de' Medici from 1453, which follows the medieval reliquary bust form, and the all'antica 16th century form seen in Michelangelo's bust of Brutus from 1539 to 40. The difference in the treatment of the termination in the all'antica type was rounded and thus required elevation on a socle. In the 16th century, the most common form of sockles were turned or architectural sockles. Thomas Martin has convincingly argued that the all'antica type started with artists in the Paduan Venetian ambient, namely with Antico and perhaps most especially with Simone Bianco, who lived from 1490 to 1555. Alessandro Vittoria continued to experiment with the bust and socle format and most often used what Nicholas Penny termed as the spreading scrolled tablet socle. He used variations of it throughout his career. He manipulated the socle and its relationship to the bust so that the sitter appeared more dynamic and animated. The sockles of the bust of Giambattista Ferretti, which you see here, along with the bust of Benedetto Mazzini, are just examples of this treatment. They make it so that the socle is asymmetrical, so that they appear as if they have been squashed by the weight and the movement of the sitters. But Leonie's solution to the problem of how to manage the base of the bust was the most dramatic and visually compelling, and it maximized the narrative potential of the base. Leonie transformed the base from a static, functional form into an active participant in the meaning communicated by the bust. While the typology of the bust was an obvious evocation of a standard Roman imperial portrait type, Leonie's inclusion of the eagle and allegorical figures at the bottom of the bust alluded to the apotheosis of the emperor, which of course was also quite standard Roman imperial iconography. More specifically, the figures of Mars and Bellona, or Minerva, both gods of war in Roman mythology, signaled imperial military might. The eagle was multivalent. It was a symbol from the Habsburgs' heraldry. It was the bird of Jupiter, god of justice, and king of the gods. And it was a standard Roman symbol of apotheosis, as I mentioned. And together with the risen Christ on Charles's breastplate and the active positioning and intensity of the expression of the sitter, the message was clear. Charles uniquely possessed the military strength and Christian devotion necessary to conquer his foes, and his achievements would be rewarded in heaven. He descended from the great ancient Roman emperors, but because of his piety, he trumped even them, just as Leone couldn't be compared to the ancients, but trumped them and his peers with his achievements in sculpture. The bust of Commodus as Hercules in the Capitoline Museum, Rome, seems like the closest precedent. However, this particular bust was not known until 1874. The bronze bust of Paul III by Guglielmo della Porta of 1546 has also been cited as an influence for Leone's bust. Here, the mantle is covered in relief sculptures of peace, justice, victory, and abundance, and the base includes two male reclining figures, prisoners or river gods, but they don't support the bust as Leone's do. There's also a medal of Ludovico III Gonzaga by Bartolomeo Melioli from 1444, wherein a mound of trophies supports the portrait and the arms are truncated at the level of the cuirass, just as in Leone's. It's not known with certainty if Leone knew either of these, but he certainly could have. There may well have been other Roman or even contemporary busts of this type that Leone could have known, but it appears that Leone's concept, particularly his effective and cohesive use of subsidiary supporting figures that amplified the symbolic meaning of the bust, may have been an entirely new one for the Renaissance viewer. I think that his contemporaries' experiments in central Italy with pedestals of large-scale sculptures as an area for figurative decoration were important for Leone's invention. Baccio Bandinelli and Benvenuto Cellini had used richly decorated pedestals for larger sculptures, but they were rectangular in plan. The base of Cellini's Perseus is composed of niches, bronze statuettes, and bronze narrative panels. Bandinelli's base for his statue of Giovanni delle Bandinere includes narrative panels, as did Bandinelli's plan for the base of the monument to Andrea Doria in Genova. Leone's conception is entirely different. In the case of the bronze bust of Charles V, the bust is supported by a sculptural group, the allegorical figures and eagle, which in turn rest on a very narrow horizontal octagonal strip. The form and significance of the base is entirely transformed in Leone's hands. Leone used the same type of truncation but modified the format of the base in the other bust of Charles V he executed, namely the marble bust in the Prado collection. The bust bears many similarities to the one of Charles V in bronze, such as the full-length cuirass, the turned head, though it's less so here than in the bronze, and the base that includes two nude figures. The figures of the base allude to the bound slaves in Michelangelo's 1513 design for the tomb of Julius II, as well as the Sistine Ignudi. The figures here are part fish, however, and perhaps are meant to signify the emperor's naval might, just as the dolphins in the bronze bust do. The center of the breastplate is decorated with the Pietà, which substitutes the image of the resurrected Christ on the bronze version. Thus, in both busts, Leone makes direct reference to Michelangelo's famous Roman sculptures as a means by which he pays homage and simultaneously links his own artistic reputation with that of the revered elder master. Moreover, the citation of Michelangelo's work for the popes in some of the most sacred sites of papal Rome bolstered the visual and political alliance between the emperor and the papacy. In this way, the bust signifies the emperor's military might and piety. It presents the emperor in a format most similar to the ancient Roman imperial bust, but specifies that the victory and virtue it celebrates are Catholic. Queen Mary of Hungary also commissioned a marble bust from Leone. In this case, the figure is more abruptly truncated, perhaps because it was harder to define a suitable cutoff point, given the widow's tunic she always wore. There is a seraph whose wings form a line to indicate the transition to the base. The base continues the same width as the figure and is of the same altar format as the marble bust of Charles. The base is decorated with low-relief terminal figures, garlands, sphinxes, and scrolls. The bases in these marble busts are significantly less open and dramatic and are much more self-contained than the bronze bust. The figures included in the bases do not project as forcefully into space as the ones in the bronze. This is, at least in part, due to the greater fragility of the material. In the case of the marble bust of the emperor, the ego of the bronze bust has been replaced by the type of base that Nicholas Penny calls an altar pedestal. The altar pedestal is used with even greater emphasis in the bust of Mary. Once again, there is a precedent for this type of support in goldsmith production of the period. Here I show one such example. This is a North Italian inkstand from the National Gallery in Washington from around 1530. This inkstand incorporates a tripod altar pedestal and has two bound crouching satyrs, garlands, shells, ornamental satyr heads, and a small relief in the center of the altar area. Perfume burners of this period, like the one in the Robert H. Smith collection, display similar features. I rather think that Leone elaborated on this type for the bust of Charles V, supplanting the altar with an eagle, and thus including figures that added to the allegorical significance of the bust as a whole. In the marble bust of Mary and Charles, Leone used a base that was closer to the altar pedestal type, reducing the scale, but, at least in the case of the bust of Charles, not the meaning of the subsidiary figures. A few major figures in the Habsburg government sought out copies of Leone's imperial sculptures directly from the artist. Others had local artists produce sculptures that were similar to them in form and style. The Duke of Alba, and we've seen most of these already today, but the Duke of Alba, Don Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, commissioned from Leone a portrait bust of himself, one of Charles V, which is obviously very much related to the bronze in the Prado, and one of Prince Philip. All three of these busts, as we know, are in Windsor Castle. In these examples, the bases are in further reduced versions of the original, basically formed of a block with an inscription. However, in the bust of Philip, Leone experimented with a drape at the terminus of the figure, and he continued the line of the figure more subtly than in the elaborated apotheosis-style base of the bronze Charles bust. Leone also made Cardinal Antoine Perrenot Granvelle a bronze copy of the same bust of Charles V, and this is in Vienna, as well as a bust of Granvelle and one of Mary of Hungary. The bust of Charles V is an exact duplicate of the original. Leone also made copies of the bust of Charles V and a bust of Philip II for Vespasiano Gonzaga. Other copies of the Charles V bronze bust are now in Gaspig, the National Gallery of Art, Washington, and the Patrimonio Nacional. They have unknown provenances, but indicate the popularity of this bust. To take the National Gallery example, which has been attributed to an unidentified Flemish artist, we can see that the torso of the figure has been slightly extended and that the base has been widened and transformed into an altar-type base. Rudolph II acquired the copy of the bronze bust of Charles V that Leone made for Granvelle. Rudolph had Adrien de Vries, who had worked with Leone on the Escorial project, make a bust of him as a pendant for it in 1603. The base figures and eagles of the de Vries bust are exactly like Leone's base figures. A full cuirass is included and the head is turned. De Vries also used this bust type for his bust of Christian II of Saxony, which is in Dresden. Clearly, Leone's bust of Charles V continued to be seen as an important exemplum of the representation of power. Leone's bust also influenced Annibale Fontana's bust of the Marchese d'Avalos, now in the Morgan. Here, there is a shorter bust, and the drapery hides the truncation. The bust is supported by a narrow and short base, which is decorated with figures in the corners in a similar fashion as the base of Leone's bust of Mary of Hungary. Other Italian examples include these busts attributed to Angelo Marini. This one of Ludovico Vistarini does so in the termination of the torso and the decorative base, as does this one of Alessandro Grassi, also by Marini. The bust of Gabriele Serbelloni and Giovanni Antonio Serbelloni of circa 1565 by an unknown sculptor reflect Leone's style in the meticulous detail of the armor and facial features of the sitters and in the extension of the torso. Leonie's bronze and marble bust of Charles V and the bust of Mary were eventually incorporated into the royal sculpture collections, along with the series of busts of Roman emperors, statuettes, and large-scale sculptures that Philip II and Philip III acquired through inheritance and state gifts. Among these were 3 series of busts of Roman emperors, which also included busts of modern rulers, including 3 of Charles V, 3 of Philip II, and 1 of Don Carlos. The paragon of ancient and modern rulers and sculptors was implicit. Even if the sculptures were not prominently displayed immediately, they clearly had an impact on the taste for sculpture among Spanish collectors. As the residences of the Alcázar Aranjuez and then the Buen Retiro were completed, sculptures were displayed in interior galleries and in outdoor garden spaces. The interest in sculpture on the part of a growing number of collectors and the idea of displaying sculptures as they were displayed in the royal collections increased markedly at that point. Marcus Burke and Peter Cherry's important contribution to the history of collections of paintings in Madrid, 1601 to 1755, documented how aristocratic patrons emulated the royals. They demonstrated that painted portraits of famous men, which sometimes included contemporaries, abounded in Spanish collections of the time. Often, portraits of members of the royal family would be positioned alongside portraits of famed rulers of the past, and then, in some cases, alongside portraits of the owner of the collection and members of his family. The placement of portraits in this way was meant to signal the learning and political connections of the owner. While it was fairly easy to acquire painted portraits of this type, sculpted portraits were obviously a greater financial burden, and it was also more difficult to locate artists who were willing and able to produce them. In our research on Spanish sculpture collections of the period from 1550 to 1700, Char Coppola and I found that ancient busts of emperors were avidly collected, and in some cases were displayed alongside busts of modern personages. Also, there are many instances of sculptures and inventories that, because of their description, are difficult to identify as busts, full-length figures, or statuettes, but the sheer numbers of sculptures make vividly apparent that previous assumptions that collectors were uninterested in sculpture are ahistorical. Here, I will merely give a chronological sampling of the portrait sculptures found in the close to 200 inventories we include in our forthcoming book, Sculpture Collections in Early Modern Spain. In Spain, a grand equestrian monument, an over-life-size standing portrait, or an elaborate tomb monument were neither feasible nor appropriate for most anyone else at court. Decorum, the financial and technological burdens, and the risk involved in the acquisition and transport of large sculptures from abroad, and the relative lack of availability of local sculptors who worked in the preferred materials of marble and bronze were prohibitive. As a result, it is rare to find examples of full-length portraits before 1625. Smaller scale portraits were much more commonly collected. They could be transported with much greater facility and were sent from Italy as gifts or commissioned from sculptors in Italy or Flanders, or from either immigrant or native Spanish sculptors. One of the most extraordinary collections I've located is that of the Condestabile de Castilla, Juan Fernández de Velasco, from 1549, in his house in Villalpando. He had an incredible collection in his museo, which is how it is named in the inventory, that included 160 sculptures of various subject matters, sizes, and materials. He had 46 busts of marble, bronze, and alabaster. There were busts of philosophers, of Roman emperors, one of Alonso of Naples, and others of unidentified men and women. The collection of the Conde de Ficayo, Juan de Borja y Castro, from 1600, included 26 busts of emperors, 3 marble figures of Charles V, Julius Caesar, and the Duke of Florence, a fountain with an equestrian statue, and a bust of Herodicus. Around this same time, the inventories of artist collections also demonstrate the prevalence of bust. Jacopo Trezzo had 2 busts, one of Marcus Aurelius and one of Faustina, and 2 lead figures of emperors. Luis de Carvajal owned heads of Faustina, Alexander the Great, Socrates, and an emperor. Juan Pantoja de la Cruz owned 4 unidentified heads. In 1608, Pompeo Leone owned over 300 sculptures, 43 of which were busts, some of which were almost certainly of his own production. There were busts of ancient emperors, 24 unidentified heads, and bust of the Empress Philip II, and 8 are vaguely identified as members of the royal family. The bust of the royals were displayed beside the ancient bust. Vicente Carduccio owned a bust of the king by Antonio de Herrera and 37 more portrait heads. Of course, artist collections are outdone by those of the most avid aristocratic collectors of their day. Juan Alonso de Pimentel y Ponce de Leon, Conde de Luna and Conde de Benavente, in 1611 owned 60 bronze, alabaster, jasper, and marble portrait busts, including 16 marble and 12 jasper and alabaster busts of emperors. Juan Hurtado de Mendoza y Mendoza, Duque de Mandas and Duque de Infantado, in 1624, owned 12 bronze emperors, lots of unidentified men and women, 12 gilded bronze emperors, and 6 stone emperors. The Duke of Lerma in 1625 had 21 busts of emperors, 12 of which were bronze, and 24 marble figures of emperors, possibly full length. Jean de Croix, Conde de Solrey, in 1638, had 13 full-length figures of emperors, probably bronze statuettes, 12 bronze heads of emperors, and 4 large bronze heads of emperors. Polesina Espinola Marqués de Leganés in 1641 owned 12 copper busts, which were brought from Flanders, 12 more busts of gilded bronze, plus a small head of the sage Merlin. Her husband's 1655 inventory lists 169 small and large-scale figures and busts, 33 bronze busts of emperors, 19 of which were gilded, 9 marble busts of emperors, and 107 additional unidentified marble busts. Beginning around the middle of the century, inventories reveal that portrait busts of family members were displayed along with other busts of famous men and women. Juan Alfonso Enriquez de Cabrera, Duque de Medina de Rioseco in 1647, owned a bronze bust of himself, among other sculptures. Rodrigo de Mendoza, Duque del Infantado in 1657, owned a bronze bust portrait of himself. Another notable collection belonged to Francisco de Mora, the Marqués de Castel Rodrigo, in 1669. In addition to a silver equestrian statue of Philip IV, he owned 25 bronze busts of emperors, 10 more bronze portrait heads, which, according to the 1675 inventory, included busts of Philip IV, Charles V, and 6 members of the House of Castel Rodrigo, plus a stone statue of an emperor, a bust of marble from Genoa, 4 metal heads, 2 marble heads, and there were 7 more bronze heads on the facade of their palace. A most impressive collection was owned by the Cardinal Duque de Moncada in Aragon and Duque de Montalto in 1672. It included 4 plaster busts colored to look like bronze, a bronze bust, and 18 gilded bronze busts de señores de la línea de los señores de Moncada en el Reino de Sicilia, with ebony bases. Perhaps most impressive of all, however, was the collection of Ana Fernández de Córdoba, Duquesa de Feria, and Pedro Antonio de Aragon. Their 1679 inventory strongly evidences the extent to which collectors sought out sculptures for their homes. They had 8 full-length statues of members of the House of Aragon, which were displayed alongside marble statues of ancient men and women, and a bronze or silver gilded statue of El Gran Capitán Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, all of which were displayed in the garden. In the main stairway, there were 28 marble busts of emperors. In the Salón Dorado, there were 16 busts of different emperors. Outside in the gardens were 72 small and large busts of emperors. In the Patio de las Hiedras, there were 5 marble busts and 2 silver heads. Finally, and I think most interesting for the context of this paper, there were 2 marble busts of men, unfortunately unidentified, with large collars, and one of them is supported by an eagle. The description of the base certainly brings to mind Leone's bronze bust of Charles V. And I feel like I should say, I'm sorry I have no images of these, but frankly, we don't know what happened to any of these things. In conclusion, Leone's ambition to outdo his contemporaries with the portrait sculptures and his good fortune in having patrons so keen to have themselves represented in new ways allowed him to enjoy a broad network of patronage. He pulled from his experience as a goldsmith and medalist to create some of the most innovative and visually compelling sculptures of the mid-16th century. Even though the sculptures weren't immediately displayed because of remodeling projects and such, they immediately had an impact on sculpture in Italy, Northern Europe, and Spain. Coupled with the interest in owning antiquities and modern sculptures influenced by antiquity, Leone's portrait bust and the ancient bust in the royal collections stimulated other collectors to seek out the same for their own enjoyment and to display their social clout. A few collectors were able to own copies of Leone's works. Some owned busts of Charles V and other members of the royal family and put them alongside busts of ancient Roman men and women. Just as collectors sought out painted portraits of the royal family and included their family members alongside them, those that had the financial means to do so sought out sculpted portraits of famous men and women of the past and present, including the Habsburgs, and in some cases, themselves and their family members. They did so because of the social prestige attached to collecting, especially given the inherent difficulties of acquiring and displaying sculptures, and they did so with greater interest and frequency than we previously believed. Thank you.